paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. 3 weeks ago, I said we'd be posting an activist website seeking justice for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. The Epstein Justice website is now up. At epsteinjustice.com, you will find a form letter that you can fill out and email to your federal representatives. You can also join the fight by sending us an email from the site. This website is long overdue. The Justice Department under 4 presidential administrations, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joseph Biden, has failed to indict the perpetrators and procurers in Epstein's pedophile network. Our movement is nonpartisan, unlike QAnon. If Donald Trump was actually going to protect the children, he would have indicted the perpetrators and procurers in the Epstein trafficking network. By not prosecuting these criminals, our federal government is aiding and abetting child trafficking. Would you ever trust anyone who is aiding and abetting child trafficking? As Americans, how can we trust our government that is aiding and abetting child trafficking? According to the Centers for Disease Control, 25% of underage girls and 7% of underage boys will be molested in the United States, which translates into 40 million women and more than 12 million men. The Democratic Party has about 60 million registered members, and the Republican Party has 55 million registered members. Survivors and their supporters could easily be the largest political party in America. As a country dedicated to children's safety, we must take a stand and pressure the government to bring the Epstein procurers and perpetrators to justice. We cannot send a message to the world that perpetrators in America who have wealth and power can molest our children with impunity. And if we allow the Justice Department to be apathetic and unresponsive to victims in a proven trafficking case, that sends a message to millions of victims that they have no voice and no hope for justice. Victims in the United States and around the world need to see that these child molesters are brought to justice. Epstein Justice put on a demonstration in December of 2021 across the street from the courthouse where Maxwell and Epstein's crimes were being covered up. The demonstration was supported by 64 anti-trafficking and anti-exploitation organizations. We now need bigger and louder demonstrations because none of the numerous perpetrators and procurers in the Epstein network have been indicted since Maxwell's trial. America, you can either let our children be molested with impunity or you can act. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Liz Franczak. How you doing, Liz?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Liz is a podcaster extraordinaire. She's one of the co-hosts of TrueAnon. And Liz, could you tell us how TrueAnon became the fountainhead of so much truth?
Oh my gosh. Well, I guess it all starts way back when Jeffrey Epstein got arrested, which we can talk about. But my friend and I, Brace Veldon, we had been just chatting very casually, texting when it happened, saying, "Oh my gosh, this is so crazy. This is wild. This is happening." Never really thought it would happen. Never thought that Epstein would ever get nabbed after the the arrest in Florida, or not the arrest, but the deal in Florida. And he was like, well, my friend has been bugging me to kind of like try recording a podcast. Maybe we could record a podcast about this. Do you want to do it? And I was like, okay, I don't know anything about podcasts or podcasting, but we could try it out. And then I think it was just 2 days later, we showed up at a very small studio apartment in the Mission where Mr. Young Chomsky was living. And we recorded our first podcast. And then it was kind of off to the races. We were just sort of having fun, and things are going well. I was down in LA, and then boom, newsflash, Jeffrey Epstein dead. And then the rest is kind of history, I guess. But we could talk about that history too.
I have been following, I'd been following Epstein since 2011,
Yeah.
2012. And I eventually got his black book in 2012, and I was pitching it to editors that would still talk to me. And I said, here's the black book. I mean, what more do you need? And they still wouldn't trust it. It was finally Gawker that stepped up. And one wouldn't think that Gawker is bathed in integrity. But they were the only ones that had the fortitude to actually take on a black book full of child molesters. Whereas these other media organizations wanted nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, Gawker's been through so many iterations, but they were definitely one of the more fun, and I guess a bit more like freewheeling kind of internet tabloid-esque blogs. And I remember when they published that, it was a pretty big deal.
Yes, and it's kind of interesting. I knew I tried to, when I first got it, I started calling victims. There's a lot of victims in the book. And at that point, Jeffrey Epstein had just been considered like a lone pedophile. And I called victims, and they told me that they'd been flown here and flown to his island. And it was all off record. And I told them that I was just spelunking to see what I could find. And then at that point, I realized that Jeffrey Epstein was running the network, and much that was very similar to the Franklin network. And as I immersed myself more and more into Jeffrey Epstein, and I talked to more and more of his victims, Franklin and Epstein become much closer than I originally thought.
How do you think, like, would he just in similar sort of like the way you kind of came about them was similar, or you think in structure similar, or what do you mean?
Well, the structure is similar, but I had erroneously thought that Jeffrey Epstein was a kinder, gentler pedophile network, because the Franklin kids, I mean, they were pandered to major sadists. I mean, just about everyone that I've talked to. And Epstein didn't seem to be that way. But I talked to one Epstein survivor who told me about a very famous politician who really beat her up, put her in the hospital for a while. And then as I've gotten to know these other Epstein victims, the mind games and the viciousness of Maxwell and Epstein and their henchwoman, Sarah Kellen, I mean, they were really vicious to these girls, really vicious.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was, I shouldn't have been stunned, because I've come across this before, but I didn't think it was that way. And last week on my podcast, I interviewed Nikolai Kamen, who was one of the Boys Town students who was trafficked. And he told me that when he was trafficked to various places, he did not know whether or not he was coming back. And I had an Epstein survivor, Julia Bryant, also say something along those lines to me. So these victims they thought that their lives were expendable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to kind of piggyback on what you were saying a little bit earlier, like, It's one thing to kind of like know something. It's like, you know, that it's very bad, and you know that it, I mean, just depraved in a kind of abstract way, right? You know, it's just like looking into some of the most vicious, dark, I don't know, just like horrible capabilities of humanity, right? And then it's another thing when you actually hear the victims themselves kind of put it in their own words, and it just kind of, it's a completely different experience, or understanding that you kind of come to, I think, in listening to kind of victims kind of tell their, tell what happened. I mean, I remember like listening to the women who came forward during the Maxwell trial, right? And even in that setting, which is so, I mean, it's not clinical, but it's the, the sort of pageantry of the US judicial system isn't, by design, is not the most like intimate atmosphere, right? You know what I mean? Like, you're not there really like listening to these you know like intimate stories. It's like a cross-examination, and there's just the horrible stuff that, both prosecutors and defense attorneys put people on the stand through. And yet, even through all of that, kind of hearing these women speak, I mean, it was just a harrowing experience. I mean, it was just horrifying.
And that trial was very carefully choreographed.
Mm, yeah, very, very, very narrow by design.
Yeah,
Yes.
the prosecutors made sure that they didn't call any victims that had been trafficked to the rich and the powerful. The victims that they called had been molested by Epstein and Maxwell. That was it.
Mm.
And that was our justice. I mean, of the hundreds, and I think we might even be talking, a couple thousand of girls that were trafficked by Epstein. There was 4 witnesses, and none of the procurers. We know who the procurers are. I mean, the New York Times wrote an article about all the procurers, or at least 6 of them, and we know who a lot of the perpetrators are. But and I just I can't let go of it. I have to keep pursuing that.
Yeah, as you should. I mean, there's so much that's still unknown, you know.
I believe that, I mean, with the Franklin scandal, it was Republicans molesting little boys. And with the Epstein scandal, it's Democrats molesting little girls.
Mm.
And that's why the Republicans aren't going after Epstein and the Democrats didn't go after Lawrence King, is because everybody's doing it, or a lot of people on both sides are doing it. But I think
Yes.
if someone augers in to Epstein, they will truly run into the cesspool that is our country, that governs our
Yeah.
country.
And I have great faith that someday we'll uncover Republicans molesting little girls and Democrats molesting little boys. I have no doubt that that is the case as well.
Yeah, I mean, I originally thought that that was the true partisan divide, but I could be
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
And what have you found found out about Epstein through your numerous podcasts? Have you found out anything that's new and disheartening? I mean, the whole thing is disheartening, but
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is disheartening. Right now, I mean, I'm very interested to see what the fallout of this case with JP Morgan, and what's gonna kind of come from that. The US Virgin Islands, as well as Jane Doe, who is being represented by David Boies, much like many of the other women who've come forward with cases against Jeffrey Epstein, have filed suit against JP Morgan Chase for facilitating the trafficking network, Epstein's trafficking network, which is really interesting. And usually you'd think that a case like that against, the largest bank in the world would just be kind of dismissed out of hands for various reasons. One, because it seems impossible to sue the largest bank in the world, let alone name Jamie Dimon, one of the most powerful men in the world, in the suit itself. But also because, like, it just sounds like the courts would just be like, this is a frivolous suit, kind of out of hand. But also because the banks are so powerful that they have so many resources to kind of make that go away. And yet it doesn't seem to be kind of going away just yet. The courts seem kind of open to hearing the sort of legal avenues that they're trying to get the banks on, which is very interesting. And what could come out of discovery from that, I mean, we don't know. I think that I believe that Chase was just ordered by court to hand over a bunch of Diamond's internal communications regarding Epstein, and of course Jess Staley, who was the JP Morgan Chase executive who later went to Deutsche, or excuse me, not Deutsche. He went to I can't remember, but he left, and then Epstein went to Deutsche after he left Chase. But I'm just curious to see what comes out of that, because one thing that no one can really explain is any of Epstein's money and how that money was getting moved around, how he got that money, where it was going. I mean, we saw a little bit kind of come out of that about that with some of the account information that was turned over during the Maxwell trial, but really there's been no good explanation for any of it. And it seems like a lot of very powerful people do know some things, right?
I personally believe that Epstein was getting most of his money from Les Wexner. I mean, Les Wexner gave Epstein the keys to his kingdom via power of attorney. And that's where I think that Epstein, I mean, he might have been speculating with some other people's money, but I think it was primarily Les Wexner's, who's turned out to be very dirty. I wrote an article about Epstein and Wexner, Southern Air Transport, which is CI proprietary airline. And he also had big time connections to the Genovese crime family too.
Mm.
And I don't know if you're familiar with there was a law firm in Columbus, Ohio that handled Wexner's legal problems. And one of the lawyers that was like the point man for Wexner was shot in the middle of the day, 2 bullets in the back of the head.
Yeah.
And I got the homicide report on that. The police chief ordered the homicide report to be destroyed, but I did get a copy of it. And that homicide report fingers Les Wexner as the perpetrator, and also gets into his organized crime. But the media doesn't really want to seem to follow. The mainstream media just doesn't want to seem to follow up on stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's always been the case, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that they think that there's no story there, or their editors tell them to look elsewhere, or there's pressure even from publishers and from whoever's like bankrolling the publishers, or whoever's even just at dinner parties with the publishers, right? I mean, I feel like that's just always the case. And so it's kind of thanks to journalists like yourself and others really following this, that any of it has even kind of come to light. And then you get mainstream media kind of like hopping back on it, like later down the line with the stories.
The mainstream media has been very good at manufacturing salacious dirt. But when it comes to any kind of justice, naming any kind of perpetrators, it hasn't done that. And as dirty as some of these guys are, I mean, and some of these guys are very, very dirty, these perps, on multiple levels. The mainstream media has given them a free pass.
Yeah.
And what are your primary complaints with the mainstream media about how?
Oh my gosh, where to start?
Yeah, let's hear them. Give us a litany.
Oh my God. I mean, I can't remember any of the statistics, like, off the top of my head, but I know that like American confidence in the media is at an all-time low. I think that trust in any kind of institutions, including the media, journalism, whatever we want to call it, is at an all-time low. And I don't know how you like blame people. right? I mean, you see the way that mainstream media covers stories, the way they kind of manufacture hysteria, the way they jump on news cycles to drive people kind of crazy. You know what I mean? If it's not one thing, it's another. And it's this sort of like tabloid frenzy without any kind of real, taking a step back and kind of trying to assess something soberly, because that's not going to drive advertisers. That's not going to drive clicks. That's not going to drive, all the rest of this nonsense bubble economy that we live in. And so you just get a bunch of frothy crap, and it drives people insane, understandably, while at the same time not trusting anything that they're believing in. And it's kind of this perpetuating cycle of, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It really worries me, you know?
Me too. I put Epstein's black book on the internet, and there has been tons of ink spilt about Epstein's black book, and only 2 publications have acknowledged that I put Epstein's black book on the internet. That's it. And I just find that kind of mind-boggling. I mean, you would think that some of these organizations would want to interview me. How did you get the black book? I mean, what does it tell us?
Right.
But no, they want nothing to do with me at this point.
Yeah.
With you and Brace, you have a very good chemistry.
Thanks.
And it had just been, you've known each other for a very long time, I'm surmising.
Yeah, we became friends. Well, we first met, I think, I want to say I was like 17, I think. His friend was dating my friend in high school. And I remember I met him when we went to me and my girlfriends, we went to we thought we were very punk in high school, which is very stupid, but we went to some like cool punk show in Berkeley at this place called Gilman, and Brace was there, and I think he had like a crazy mohawk or something. He used to look so crazy. And that's when I first met him. And then I moved back to San Francisco in my early 20s, and we kind of like reconnected then. He was, a pretty big mess, I'd say, which he's talked about at length. But we always kind of like kept, we'd always kind of be around. We always had similar friend circles. San Francisco is such a small town, I mean, I worked in a vintage store, and all of our friends, were either working in restaurants or bars or record shops or whatever it was. I mean, it was, this is before all of the tech companies moved in, and you could still afford to live in San Francisco for super, super cheap. I mean, I think I lived in Lower Haight, and I paid like, there was one room I had that I paid like $450, but I lived with a bunch of like 40-year-old punk dudes who had been there since the 80s, who had great stories and were very cool. But but I mean, we it was just like kind of a fun time before, really San Francisco just exploded with new tech money and everyone got priced out. But Brace and I kind of reconnected then, and then over the years sort of stayed in touch online. And then I ended up moving back again to the Bay Area. I had left for quite some time, like 7 or 8 years. I lived in LA, and I was back up in the Bay Area in like 2018, 2019, and he and I reconnected and we're hanging out a bunch. And it was really that was really then that we started, like I said, one evening texting. I remember sitting on my couch texting and with him about Epstein, and we just decided to record a podcast. Let's try it out. And I don't really know. I mean, yeah, we do have great chemistry. I mean, we are good friends in real life. I don't know why I say real life, because, the podcast is real life too. But I mean, off recording, like he and I are very close. And I think that the we have a real tenderness for each other and real care for each other. And I think a lot of that comes through subconsciously on the show.
So you were both punkers back in your youth.
I really wasn't. I mean, I was more like just kind of hanging out with my friends. I wasn't super punk. I was probably more of the like dreaded hipster. Like Brace would, even just the other day, Brace and I were talking about something. He's like, me, I'm super punk. I hate hipsters. I was like, oh no, that was probably me. But he definitely was, and he still has that Mr. Maximum rock and roll shtick that he loves. That's probably like, yeah, part of his, just on, in his bloodstream at this point.
I was a rebellious youth in the 70s, and all we had to do was grow our hair long and not take baths.
Yeah, see, you got it easy.
Yeah.
Kids nowadays, they got to do all this crazy stuff.
Yeah. I mean, all I had to do when I wanted to integrate into society, which took probably far too long, I just had to cut my hair and take a bath, and I was ready to roll. And maybe get in, some new jeans.
Yeah. I feel like, I don't know, that's probably still a thing now. I think I see a lot of stinky people in Brooklyn.
With our government, so our government has aided and abetted child trafficking at the very least. It's aided and abetted child trafficking, and as sane citizens, we would never trust an individual that's aiding and abetting child trafficking. How can we trust our government that is aiding and abetting child trafficking on any level? How can we trust them?
Well, I mean, how can we trust them for anything? I don't know. I mean, but at the same time, like, are we sane? I mean, I think, I don't think people think in those terms. I think some maybe part of the project is to sort of get people to realize like how insane our system is, on the level of criminality. Absolutely. The level of, how the sort of terminal chaos of our system is enforced, right? The kind of enforcement mechanisms, whether that's, abroad, whether that's at home, there's so many different kind of layers to that, but that the absolute that people are not crazy. Our system is terminally insane. It's completely it's chaos, and that's by design, right? So I think that part of the project is really kind of getting into that.
So do you think it's important to get people into the streets? I mean, is that going to be the only way that I probably think that's the only way things are going to change, is if we get people into the streets?
Well, I mean, historically that's been so. Into the streets for what, though? I mean, I think that, like, it's, you think back to, a lot of people like to point to the Iraq War protests, you know what I mean? And saying like, that was the largest, demonstration in history. So many people out in the streets, and it didn't do anything. It didn't change anything, And so you have to kind of ask, well, where's the pressure points that kind of, organization, if we want to call that organization, setting that aside, but what are the kind of pressure points that's, where is it putting pressure on? Is demonstrating in the streets, is that really something that can put pressure on the sorts of levers of power in the state that can exert any kind of positive influence, or any kind of influence at all? Like, maybe not, right? Like, maybe those aren't the kind of pressure points in society, just sort of general mobilization. Maybe it needs to be a bit more strategic, or at a bit more, at kind of pain points, right? Where you can sort of exert some control and gain some concessions for something to change.
Right now, the right and the left are completely polarized. The left views the right as insane because of QAnon, and the right views the left as insane because of the woke culture. The only issue that can bring the right and the left together is child abuse and preventing child abuse. I think that is the only issue that could bring the right and the left together.
I mean, I think it's not just the right and the left that hate each other. I think that there's so many there's just groups everywhere that have kind of we've sort of, I would say, across the spectrum, we really are grouping people together in whatever groups they are. You know, you always see people say, oh, it's the professionals, or, oh, I mean, even tonight, right? It's the journalists, or, oh, it's the right. Oh, it's the truckers. Oh, it's the MAGAs. Oh, it's the, you know, there's all these different, we have in our head these images of these groups that are really, those are the ones that are really doing it. And I'd say across the board, it's a problem that rather than seeing us as any kind of cohesive society with, you know, we're just very easily, it's very easy for all of us to kind of slip into just grouping people together and saying, oh, it's their fault. Oh, it's their fault. I would say that's a tendency that really needs to be pushed back on, right?
I personally believe the polarization of the right and the
Yeah.
left has just been a virtuoso performance. It goes back a long time, divide and conquer. And when I got into Franklin, I realized that it's not the right and the left that had the power. It was some malignant corner of our intelligence that has the power. Like Andrew Acosta, the U.S. attorney for the District of Southern Florida, he was told to stand down. The feds had a list of like 34 victims or 35, and he was told to stand down. And there's only two people constitutionally that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the president, and one is the attorney general.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the kind of power that this malignant corner of our intelligence has, that they can, and we saw it again with Franklin. Same exact thing. U.S. attorneys were told to stand down. So I personally believe that this is the issue that can wake people up. I don't, if this issue can't wake people up, I don't know if any issue can.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you talk about polarization, it's funny because we were talking about the media and social media. I think social media has also driven that, just put it on hyper speed or whatever, you know. It's like, or like fed kind of our systems, you know, our system's tendency to drive kind of towards middle class polarization of, you know, certain issues and advocacy. Like social media has just put that on methamphetamine or something, you know. And it's sort of it's almost breathtaking to watch, like how elegant a system it is, right? Of you know, this sort of like chaos in this highly polarized political system that then only produces this like weird state stability. You know what I'm saying? Like Biden gets elected or even Trump gets elected and not much has changed, right? When you go back and you look over the past couple, you know, I don't know, 25, 30 years, it's really just a continuation, right? It's not as if it's been a highly volatile, you know, or that there's been big swings and, you know, on the margins, absolutely. And maybe, you know, maybe that those margins are getting closer and closer to the middle, but, you know, really, it produces a quite stable political system while being so kind of this kind of tendency towards polarization being so chaotic in itself. It's breathtaking.
I had a friend once write, if ignorance was truly bliss, there wouldn't be so many Americans on Prozac. And, with our system, so Epstein, the Epstein cover-up started with Bush 1, and it went through Obama, and it went through Trump, and now it's going through Biden. So 4 presidential administrations have covered this up, 2 Democrat, 2 Republican. QAnon felt like Donald Trump was going to save the children. But if Donald Trump was truly going to save the children, there would have been a lot of people indicted that Epstein was pandering children to. So when I hear about QAnon today, I'm kind of amazed. You would think that Donald Trump not indicting any of those perps would be the end of QAnon, but people need a religion.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, I think there's been like studies on this, is that when a prophecy fails, groups tend to actually double down in their beliefs rather than kind of come to terms with the reality, or their reality kind of shattering in front of them, right? And so it's not totally surprising that a lot of people in the Q community, if they'd like that, have sort of tried to explain away some of those inconsistencies and like confusion, like you say, like, oh, if he was going to save the children, why didn't he arrest everyone? And there's always an answer, right? There's always an answer that furthers down the hole and furthers down into the lore of whatever it is. I mean, I think Q is a very extreme example of that response mechanism, but that you could see that across the political spectrum in various instances, because it's really difficult to deal with. You're fed, or you're fed this sort of view of the world, this kind of like holistic, especially like QAnon, right? It presents itself as this like total explanation for how the universe functions, right? And it's so perfect and complete, and it touches on everything. It's got lizard people, it's got Godzilla, it's got aliens, it's got Epstein, it's got Trump. It has any funny thing that you could think of, it's in there.
And
it's like
it has the Democrats,
it's like the Marvel,
yeah.
It's the Marvel comic, universe or whatever, but for, I don't know, pedophile vampires. But when the cracks start to show in that, that can be a very destabilizing experience. It's almost like your identity gets like fractured, because for a lot of these people, they've been literally living in this world online. It's totally immersive. It's their friends, it's their connections, it's how they've started to conceive of themselves is only in this world. And so for it to fall apart, I mean, it would cause a complete and total identity breakdown, which some people can deal with and try to move on and process. But for the most part, that's a very scary experience. And so, our brain wants to reject it. And I think you see that, like I said, I think QAnon is a very extreme example of that. There's the example of, there's the people and the Bolsonaro supporters trying to come to terms with that as well in Brazil, which then they're not, because they live in this like WhatsApp world that is literally a lie. But you see it elsewhere as well, with people not being able to come to terms with actual reality. But unfortunately for them, unfortunately for us, for everyone, like the rubber hits the road at some point, and that can be very scary for a lot of people.
Stalin's gulags were filled with thousands of people who thought if Stalin really knew about this, he'd put an end to it. Which I find remarkable, but that is actually a true statement. It's denial. When I was pitching the Franklin scandal to editors, I could see the machinations in their mind. And then the cognitive dissonance. They would say, this is really a horrible story. I mean, all these children have been abused with impunity. I need to do something about this. Or, I could write Nick Bryant off as crazy right now. Yeah. And then I could go home and eat with my family and watch television and have a good night.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I got around to pitching Epstein, there was that mark on me. Yeah, this guy's crazy. And what's funny about that is Epstein corroborated everything I was saying about Franklin. But yet mainstream media did not want to touch me with that. It was kind of interesting.
I think the thing that's interesting about Epstein, I mean, there's so much, but one of the things that's interesting in terms of like the popular understanding is I think everyone sort of just accepts it. They're like, oh yeah, that happened. I don't think there's anyone on the street that's like, I mean, I think it's a very, I think that the number of people that believe that even not getting into the, did he kill himself? Did he not kill himself question, but everyone sort of is like agrees, oh yes, Bill Clinton was on the island doing sex crimes and trafficked women, right? Like everyone kind of agrees on the very sort of broad strokes without understanding the nitty-gritty, not getting into the banking stuff, not getting into the shadowy corporation stuff, not even getting into the Lex Wexner stuff. Everyone sort of agrees, yes, something bad was going on at Victoria's Secret, yes, something bad was going on with some of these bankers, with these politicians on the island. And so they kind of all agree to the broad strokes of it. And then that's it. It's sort of just like, well, yes, that's how it is. Like, that's at least, I don't know what you think, but I think that seems to be the kind of attitude of the more like mainstream kind of journalist, right?
I think to get something done here, we're going to have to bypass the mainstream media. I attended the biggest anti-Iraq rally, and that was right by the United Nations, and there was tens of thousands of people there. And the New York Times way underreported the number of people that were there. And I've seen the New York Times underreport, and other publications totally underreport protests and demonstrations. But I truly believe that this is an issue. You know about the Dutroux scandal in Belgium, where at least 200,000 Belgians hit the street. Now, there's a lot more heterogeneity in the United States, but I think that issue is still a preeminent concern, is the government covering up child abuse. And there's cognitive dissonance there for sure. But I think it's the only thing that can get people out into the streets other than starvation. But since 2% of Americans live on farms and they can produce food for the 98% of the rest of us, our masters know that revolutions start when people get hungry. So we're not going to get hungry. We're just going to eat shitty food.
I think, I think a lot of people are being, I mean, we talk about the kind of polarization in the media and the kind of insanity that people have been feeling. I don't know if you feel this way, but I think that a lot of people have been feeling just completely insane for the past couple of years, right? Especially if they're really plugged in to like the news and the media and all of that. And I mean, QAnon being a great example, right? But it's almost like we've all just sort of accepted that the media lies to us, but it still just continues to drive us insane. Like even today, I think it's just today, right? That the media and the politicians are saying, oh, how the Fed is handling the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, right? This isn't a bailout. It's not a bailout. And everyone's arguing over oh no, it's not a bailout. Don't worry, it's not a bailout, because they don't want it to be associated to the baggage of, the bailout of the banks in 2008 and the TARP program and all of that. And so, oh, it's not a bailout. But it's like everyone can see that's what it is. Of course, that's what it is. And it's just like this kind of continued gaslighting that I think is just really driving people crazy. And I don't know where it ends. It's sort of scary to think about where it ends, right?
I think you've got the bailout in 2008 from banks that were doing very illegitimate things with various derivatives. I mean, some of those derivatives were just completely insane.
Yeah.
But we bailed them out, and they've been, I mean, and the amount of money that like the CEOs were rewarding themselves for doing a bad job was kind of mind-boggling. The amount of our money was just kind of mind-boggling. And now students who are way in debt because education is so expensive,
Yeah.
that's got to go before the Supreme Court, and it's going to go before a pervert like Clarence Thomas and someone a sexual assault individual like Kavanaugh. I mean, and who knows how these other justices are compromised too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think our political system is basically a handful, a very large handful of judges who are just disgusting people, and bankers who are also disgusting people. And that's basically, I mean, Congress is a joke. What I mean, that's basically who runs. We've got central bankers and we've got we've got the judiciary, and that's sort of the American state, it seems like, you know.
And these kids that are $60,000 in debt because of college, who become debt slaves as soon as they graduate, no one is, I mean, the Biden administration is ostensibly trying to bail them out, but the fact that it goes before the Supreme Court, and given what the Supreme Court's been doing,
Yeah.
it's not really, I personally think that these kids will be deprived of, and they'll have to
Yeah.
pay, so they'll have to continue being a debt slave because
Well, I mean, someone has to stand up to the courts. I mean, that's where this ends, is in constitutional crisis, right? I mean, no one wants to say that, but either you respect that the judiciary can just shut down any kind of program or gut any kind of regulatory body or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff that's coming up on the Supreme Court docket, or you have an insane executive, or not insane, but like a strong-willed executive, whatever party, whatever politician. I pretty much hate all of them, so it's not like my not like what I like is going to get done anyway. But or you have one of them stand up to the to the judges, to the Supreme Court, and say, no, like, how do you enforce it? Try enforcing it. I mean, that's how this always has to come down to. But that's also a very scary proposition that I don't think anyone should be really rooting for, right? I mean, things can kind of get out of hand very quickly there.
there was a book written about Clarence Thomas, Strange Justice, and he's a misogynist. I mean, there were a number of women who he abused, like Anita Hill.
Yeah,
And
he
actually,
seems like a
there was
total pig.
there was like 7 or 8, and Jay Mayer, who wrote the book, there was a video place around the corner from where he lived, and he's also a porno junkie. So we've got a misogynist porno junkie as a Supreme Court justice. And what's really interesting about that, there were a number of women that could have testified, and been on Anita Hill's side. But there was one, Angela Wright, she was in Washington, D.C. and ready to testify. And Joseph Biden lifted her subpoena.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that the Democrats that Joseph Biden allowed someone like Clarence Thomas onto the Supreme Court, and he's against all the ideas that the Democrats stand for. But yet, Joseph Biden, you would think that the Democrats would elect him dog catcher, but now he's our illustrious president.
I mean, yeah, that's how these elite circles go. You don't break the Yale Honorary Society code or whatever. I mean, it's just is what it is. He was supposed to get nominated. He was supposed to get, put on the court, and, no one's going to stand in the way of that.
I found here, I've got all of Lawrence E. King. He's the individual that ran the pedophile network that I wrote about in the Franklin scandal. I've got all his party lists, and Clarence Thomas is on there. And when King went down, all the Republican big shots fled from him like rats on a sinking ship again, but Clarence Thomas, and said it was truly unfortunate. Our man Clarence.
Well, speaking of Q, I mean, his wife was all
yes. Well, About 10 years ago, his wife demanded that Anita Hill apologize to him. And I think she even might have left a voicemail for Anita Hill. So that kind of demonstrates her capacity for denial.
Yeah, those disgusting people.
And speaking of Twitter, I was on Twitter and I said something about Kavanaugh being a rapist. And someone said, well, that woman, she's got this problem and that problem and that problem. I said, well, that might be that woman, but there's other women. So again, denial.
Yeah.
It's there's only one person in my family that has read the Franklin scandal. And they love to bask in their ignorance. And the one that did read it, my sister divorced him. So so actually no one in my family
not because of the book, not because of the book.
What's that?
Not because of the book.
No, right? he had some character defects that were really troubling my sister, as they should have been. But okay. Yeah, no one in my family other than him has read the Franklin scandal, because they have their belief, their little pristine beliefs, and they don't want to take a sledgehammer to them. Yeah. And I felt the same way when I started to do research and I came across the Finders document that ultimately led me to Franklin.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys were seemingly really abusing these children. And then the CIA quashed the investigation, and the CIA is not supposed to have any kind of domestic jurisdiction. And I thought I knew how the world worked prior to reading that document. I mean, I really did. I'd been an academic for 5 years, and I'd studied philosophy, and I really kind of thought, I know how it works. And then I saw that, and that was a completely different paradigm from how I was approaching the world. And I was just, I was stunned, but I was really driven to understand it. How did I miss this? What are the larger implications of this? Did you get that when you read the Franklin scandal?
I mean, I don't see how anyone can not read that book and be like, oh my God, so much of what I think I understand, I don't, I mean, it's just so, it's so rich with, I mean, I don't mean to, just horrifying details, and, so yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's difficult to kind of walk away from that book with a kind of the same outlook on the world as you had prior to it, which again, that can be a very destabilizing experience for a lot of people, right? But I hope that doesn't dissuade people from reading your book. But
people have told me, Nick, it's really hard to read that book. And I would say, well, try writing it for 7 years.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean, we've talked, and I have talked about that, but that's an intense process of reporting that,
I, on my podcast last week, as I said, I had a Boys Town victim, and it was kind of interesting when he had been trafficked from 1985 to 1988 while he was at Boys Town, but he had lived in foster care homes where this kid was, it's just amazing that he's functional now. And, but when I was doing my due diligence on trying to corroborate his story, I couldn't find him in the Boys Town yearbooks. So, and it was kind of a weird thing, because I believe this has happened to me a couple of times in my career. I believed what he was saying, but the evidence just didn't show what he was saying or demonstrate what he was saying. And I finally met some people in federal law enforcement, and I had to cultivate a relationship with them, and they wanted some information from me, and I wanted some information from them. and I gave them the information that they wanted, and they told me, and this kid, he came back, one of the big kickers of his story is he came back from a very sadistic weekend with King et al. And he told his family teachers at Boys Town, I just can't do it anymore. I can't fly with King anymore. And he was sent to a psychiatric hospital the next day in Georgia. Boys Town put him on a plane and sent him. And that was a little out there too, but those feds corroborated that. And I went back to the kid and I said, Nicholas, I'm really sorry that, I pushed you the way I pushed you, but I didn't, everything that there wasn't any corroboration with anything that you said. Now everything is corroborated. So it was, you get into situations like that with victims. They can be very, very difficult. Although I found Nikolai to be pretty easy to get along with. But victims are, a lot of victims that I encountered with Franklin are so immersed in drug addiction. That, and the only way that I think they'll be able to address what happened to them would be, I mean, they would have to get clean and then do some pretty heavy duty psychotherapy, I believe. Liz, it's been great having you on the Nick Bryant Show.
Oh, thank you so much. I love talking to you.
And is there any questions or comments that you'd like to close with?
Oh, questions or comments? No, I don't think so. Just, we've got to have you back on the show at some point soon. I'm
going to get that book on Watergate. The book on Watergate was supposed to be published a while back. And I was given an assignment to quote unquote edit a book that was 1,000 pages that had a lot of science. I was a science reporter for 12 years and it had a lot of science in it. And that book just took me over. I bet. It was, the manuscript was 1,000 pages. And by the time I had finished rewriting, it was like 200 pages. So.
Oh no. Oh no. That's never good. Oof. You never want to be the author in that scenario. You get your book back and you're like, oh shit.
Well, I kind of girded him a little bit. I said, I think we're going to get about 250 pages out of this.
Oh my God. Well, that's good at least.
And, but his research was pretty amazing in some areas, but he lacked a lot of the precision that,
I see,
that a science reporter requires. And, but so that book consumed my life. I mean, I'd wake up at like 4 a.m. and I would start thinking about it, but now it is done. And,
yay, congratulations.
I'm going back to Watergate. And, it's kind of interesting, at the heart of Watergate, and my book will demonstrate this, was a CIA blackmail operation. Primarily women. But yeah, it was. And it's so amazing to me that the way that history has been rewritten, and Woodward and Bernstein are pathological liars. I mean, I'll show that in the book, that their lies are kind of mind-boggling. I mean, they would lie when they didn't even need to lie. I mean, so that'll be it. And I look forward to being on the show, on your show.
Yeah, me too. I look forward to reading the book.
Well, Liz, have yourself a great night. And give Brace my best.
I will. Thank you so much.